Now let's talk about a different kind of chord in thirds. We're talking about superimposed thirds, but now forming polyharmony. So what's the difference between what we were looking at before and polyharmony? The difference is that in polyharmony, the strands or the different aspects of the texture are separated either in register or with tone color. In other words, here you're really not supposed to hear the whole thing as one chord, but as two layers of harmony. Obviously, this depends to some extent on orchestration, which is a subject we're going to be coming back to later on in this series of classes. But the important thing here is just to realize that simply taking a 9th or 11th, 13th, this doesn't count as a polyharmony. However, if we do it here, it's quite likely to be a polyharmony, assuming that the rest of the texture of the piece follows the same kind of thing. Let's listen now to example 15. This tells us something about the way, at least Persichetti thinks, that polychords originated. In the left hand here we have one stable chord, a C major chord, and the right hand is wandering around freely. The result of that is that we really feel there are two layers in the texture. What holds it together is that the first chord and the last chord are consonant with the chord underneath. In that sense, they come back as they would in a normal pedal tone situation. With polychords, they wouldn't necessarily come together the same way, but there would be this separation between the two elements. Let's listen to that again. It's important, if we want to hear this kind of stratified harmony, that each layer groups clearly. We've already mentioned that that can be done with register, can be done with different kind of instrumental sound. It's also a good idea generally if each layer has one kind of familiar sonority. For the moment, we're going to talk about triads as being that familiar sonority, although in principle the same thing could be done with fourth chords or clusters or whatever, but we'll talk more about that another time. So for now, we're going to talk about triads in polyharmony. Okay, so registral and timbral separation. A few points to notice. If you listen to example 16a, just showed us two versions of the same polyharmony phrase. What have I done? Well, in 16a, we have a first chord, D flat major chord, then a B flat major chord on top, then D major, E major, C major, D major, D flat major, F major. So those chords with a certain amount of separation. Still retain some kind of independence, but the fact that each layer is made of triads lets it hold together, or helps it hold together, or come together as a unified whole. If we look at the second example in 16a, or the second half of 16a, all I've done here is I placed them closer together. Notice how the layering becomes less obvious. We can hear the relationship between the first two bars and these two bars over here, but the feeling of stratification is much less obvious. Of course, this is musically usable also, but the stratification is not so obvious. Now here's an interesting point. We could invert the layers independently. In other words, if we look at 16b, in 16b what I've done is I've taken the same combination of chords, but I've just inverted the components. So the D flat major, instead of being this, is now this. The B flat, instead of this, is this. If we listen to it, however, the family resemblance is pretty clear. Doesn't sound that far from. However, one thing we cannot do is invert the whole chord. In other words, I can invert each component, but not the whole thing. The last two bars in the example shows what happened if I do that. Well, we sense some relationship, but the kind of harmony now includes a lot of clusters, which really ends up sounding like something quite different. So it's sort of like a more distant relative in the same family. Another way to make sure that polyharmony feels like different layers is to make sure that the interval between the two layers is not a simple triadic interval. If we look at example 17 for the first chord, well, the bottom note on the top layer is B, but B would just be the seventh in the C major chord underneath. So that tends to blend into one sonority. There's a certain amount of separation because of the register, but there isn't a great deal of conflict. Let's compare the second chord in example 17. There's less blend because the A, the bottom note on the top layer, does not fit in the C major chord, and then there's the C sharp, which also conflicts. So this is more blended than that. This, the second one, is what real polyharmony tends to sound like. We've already mentioned that, unlike real polytonality, the strands don't really remain in one clear key area, but they fluctuate freely. So how are they determined? Well, it's especially important to pay attention to the outer voices. Although polyharmonic texture doesn't require that each stratum be exactly parallel, generally what happens is the outer voices, the extreme outer voices, the top and the bottom, tend to have a sort of determining effect. Let's listen to example 18. If I play example 18 with only the outer voices, we'll notice something interesting. The combination of the outer voices, for the most part, is fairly consonant. We have a passing dissonance here. I'll get back to that in a second. Then the seventh here, it resolves onto the fifth. Now that passing dissonance, if it was just a two-part counterpoint, would really stick out. However, with all the other notes, that dissonance doesn't make the whole thing much stronger or much more, isn't accented very much at that point. What is interesting here, though, is when we listen to the whole thing, although we definitely hear two levels moving independently, we don't hear 6 levels. We hear 2. We hear the bass sort of fattened up by various chords on top of it, and the top line fattened up by various chords, triads, all of them, underneath. This is very typical of polyharmonic writing. So in a sense, although we may listen to many notes, we are only listening to 2 planes of tone. If the outer parts, as in this case, are generally quite consonant, it also tends to pull the whole together in a certain way. Notice that, as in this one, sometimes 7th and 9th chords will result on the way. Or 7th chord, so on, 9th chord. Okay, that in itself doesn't mean very much. The real point is where are they coming from, where are they going. As usual, it's more important to see the chord in context than to have a label for it, because then you know how to use it.